So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming to this webinar. I'm Michelle Gwiley, one of the school counseling specialists for the Utah State Board of Education. And today we will be talking about the Elementary School Counseling Implementation Guide and how that relates to the school counseling program model. So just to start off with the overall mission and vision that we have as school counselors, we are student focused. And we want all students to have access to a high quality school counseling program. So that includes students that are in elementary schools. And school counselors really work to support student success by being data driven, by collaborating with stakeholders, and really being a key part of the school leadership team where they're able to support those decisions related to school improvement, to school climate, all of those various areas. So like I mentioned, today we're really going to focus on that elementary implementation guide. And again, this is a supplement to the program model that really provides some additional insights and resources to help elementary school counselors to implement a comprehensive school counseling program. So it really just gives those specifics of what would this look like in an elementary school. So with that, really important before we use the implementation guide to understand the role of the elementary school counselor and what a school counseling program looks like in the elementary setting. Really, school counselors in elementary are prevention, right? Really building that strong foundation for all students to be successful throughout their time in education as well as life after high school, right? So really being focused on tier 1 supports for all students, right? So elementary school counselors should be spending a lot of time in the classroom, really focused on that tier 1 prevention. So like I mentioned, one of the things that I love about school counseling and makes us different from some of the other professions that our students support in the school is that we are data driven, right? Data helps us to answer the question, is the school counseling program making a difference for students, and how can I show that? Right? A lot of other professions that help support students don't really have this data piece as a requirement. So I think it's really a great strength of our program model to have this data informed piece. So really being intentional in how we collect and analyze our data. So there's different types of data. We have that process, perception, and outcome data. So our process data, just kind of collecting those numbers, right? How many students participated in your lesson? How long was the lesson? How many small groups you had? Things like that. That perception data is kind of that pre-post of your lessons. Do students now understand this concept? Do they feel more confident in this skill that I taught? As well as getting that perception data from your school faculty, your parents, your community, right? How are they viewing the school counseling program? And how are they viewing their students' progress based on the services you're providing? And then outcome data. That is kind of the heart of school counseling data, is what are the outcomes for students, right? Is this changing their academic achievement? Is this changing their behaviors? Is it changing their attendance, right? So really making sure that we are being super intentional in what data we are collecting and why, and then how we use that to really guide our program. So that data should give us an idea about what do we do in our collaborative classroom instruction? What topics are needed? What things might be needed in specific grade levels or even into a specific classroom, right? So really using that data to guide our program and to help set some goals. So while it is not required for elementary school counselors to submit a data project to us at USBE, we highly, highly recommend that at the elementary level, you are still conducting a data project. Because like I mentioned, we have that really unique position to be working with all students and having this focus on data and making the connections between all these different pieces, right? So connecting the school improvement plan with the work that we're doing, with the work that teachers are doing, right? We're kind of in the middle spoke of that wheel of school. So we do have a lot of resources for data and data projects. So we have our data project template, which is available on the USBE website. If you ever have problems accessing any of those materials, you are welcome to email us and we can send you those links directly or those files. But we do have that template that has an instructions tab that walks you through what all of the different elements mean, like when you're choosing your data types or your student groups, setting your SMART goal. So that template walks you through all of those pieces. We also have an additional resource that's a rubric that you can use to kind of evaluate how you're doing on your data project. Am I making my SMART goals specific, measurable? Do I have that timepiece on them? Or am I not so great at that SMART goal and need to do some work, right? So saying we're going to increase student reading scores, right? To instead being we're going to increase student reading scores on the Aspire test by 5 points by March 30th, right? So really being able to reflect and have that rubric to decide, are you getting close on those things? Are there things you need to work on? Or are you fully implementing all of those elements of the data project? So both of those templates are available on our website. And the other piece that we think is very important is making sure we are sharing with stakeholders, right? We need to share our data story with those important stakeholders so that they can understand what school counselors do. They can see the value of the school counseling program, right? And then they can help us make improvements. So a couple of examples: faculty meetings, advisory council meetings, any of your school teams that are meeting in your PLCs, school community council. It's also great when you can share these out like on your social media channels, your school website. The only thing is just to keep in mind that student data privacy piece, that we don't want to identify any students, but in general, you can share probably a lot of the charts and graphs that speak to the work you've done on your data project with these important stakeholders to let them know what you're doing in your program. So really important to share those data projects as well. So shifting gears a little bit into the elementary implementation guide, we are going to go over kind of the 4 components or delivery modalities that we have in our school counseling program model. So the first area for is the plan for college and career readiness. This is a direct service, which means this is something we are doing with students, right? Directly with students. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this is tier 1 for all students, right? So all students should be getting kind of this college and career readiness piece. And it's really embedded throughout all of the other elements that we're going to talk about in just a minute. At the elementary level, it is not as standalone as it is in secondary with the requirements that we have in state code to have college and career readiness planning meetings. But those foundational concepts are kind of embedded and woven into those other elements that we're going to talk about. The next area, again, all students, tier 1 is collaborative classroom instruction. So really making sure that you are developing lessons that will teach those students standards. And we're going to dive into these a little bit more in just a second. So the other 2 areas that we have are systemic approach to dropout prevention with social emotional supports. Again, this is a direct service. We are working with students for this. So this would be that responsive services piece, any group or individual counseling, maybe short-term crisis counseling, and kind of those school-wide approaches that you take as far as trauma-informed and restorative practices. The last piece is indirect services. So these are things that are kind of done on behalf of students, right? They're not in the room with us as we perform these things, but they are for students indirectly, right? So that indirect services piece. And this is our collaboration, consultation, referral, professional learning, and kind of all of the day-to-day things you need to make sure that your program is running. So those are kind of the 4 areas that our work breaks out to. So diving a little deeper into these elements, like I mentioned previously, college and career readiness and career literacy is really at the elementary level about awareness, exploration, kind of getting that idea of what they are planning for as they grow up. And sometimes we get some pushback saying elementary school is too young to talk about college and career readiness. But I remember I've done this and I've had this question asked to me when I was a kid. What do you want to be when you grow up, right? That's kind of a common question that we have when we talk with younger children about what do they want to be when they grow up. So this is a very common thing that we hear outside of the education setting, right? Thinking about what they want to do for careers. So really making sure that this idea of exploration, awareness, just kind of that knowledge piece is really infused into all of the activities that we're doing and getting other members and other stakeholders involved, right? So really including parents in this process, community members, just everyone making sure that we kind of have that culture in our school, that we are making sure that students are ready to be successful in their lives, right? Whatever comes for them, life after high school, college, career, life ready, right? And so again, we do have another activity document that kind of goes into some more specific examples that you can access on our website. So collaborative classroom instruction, this is like the meat and potatoes of school counseling at the elementary level, making sure you are in the classroom, spending time building those skills for all students, right? We really want to make sure that we use this to build rapport with our students, to get to know all of our students. So it's not just about delivering instruction, it's also about building that relationship. We all know the data and the research on how important it is to have that caring adult. So this is one way that we can start to build those relationships, is really making sure we're in the classroom interacting with students. Now on here, this last bullet point is the note that sometimes we need to look at how our program is working at tier 1 before we're adding more and more activities at those higher tiers, right? So if our percentages are going higher than what's kind of suggested or recommended, or that we're even capable of performing, we need to take a step back and look at what are we doing at tier 1. Are we providing enough skill building? Are we providing enough modeling? Are we providing enough instruction to all students that we can then have the numbers to support a tier 2 and tier 3 service that's going to not strain our school counselors, right? So if you're spending a lot of your time doing kind of those tier 2, tier 3 things, we got to take a step back and say, I need to beef up my tier 1, right? That collaborative classroom instruction. So an example of this, I think, since the pandemic has started, is with like anxiety, social skills, things like that, right? So previously, maybe in a school, we would have a handful of students that had, that anxiety that was to a level that we needed to have some strategies for them, right? That number has probably increased. And I hear this a lot, that there are more students struggling to come to school because of anxiety, concerns with, social interactions, making friends. So maybe something that used to be at the tier 2 level to do like a small group with those students, maybe some of that content can be adapted to be implemented at that tier 1 for all students, making sure that all students have these things, right? And the other thing on my soapbox is not making those assumptions that students have learned skills. And I think we did this a lot, and the pandemic has definitely amplified these things, that students missed out on kind of those normal developmental milestones. And I'm sure you're seeing this a lot, especially at the elementary level, where they haven't maybe had that time in school to know, this is how I share at recess. This is how I do this activity with my peers. So we might have to consider some more explicit instruction to make sure students understand and can kind of really have those skills and experiences. So really important with collaborative classroom instruction to make sure that you are communicating with your administrator. They got to be on board with what you're doing. And also really making sure you're working closely with teachers. They are really our advocates, and we are all on the same team working for students. And it's great to have them in the room with you as well, so that they can hear the same information. They can reinforce those concepts, ideas that you have from your lesson. So really making sure that you're working with your teachers. And another piece that's super important, I think it's on this slide, is that we're prepared for these lessons, right? So teachers are doing lesson plans, they've got all of their materials, things like that. As school counselors, we're not in the classroom all day, every day, but we need to kind of have that same level of preparation, that we have a written plan, we have our materials, we know what we want to accomplish, like what are the student objectives that we're having, what standards are we looking to measure? What data do we need to collect, right? So really being prepared with that proactive written kind of scope and sequence of what you want to do with your lessons, right? And on here again, making sure that you're including teachers and other staff in those lessons so that they can know those words, right? So they can understand that when we talk about bullying, maybe you use like a book example, and then you can make sure that all the staff know that that's what it means, right? So really making sure that teachers are kind of an active part on here. So you'll see that that collaborative piece is kind of called out to make sure that we're including them, right? Really important to have their support as we go through this process. So really, again, CCR, College and Career Readiness, is really interwoven into all that we're doing with collaborative classroom instruction, right? So sometimes it's important to specifically call out, you know what, we talked about working together with our friends today. Do you think your parents have to work together with people they see every day at their office? Yeah, probably, right? So sometimes we need to have that specific call out, but everything that we're doing really prepares students for life after high school, right? So really making sure that you're aware of how you're meeting those expectations, but then also kind of talking to students and starting to make them think about, you know what I'm learning now is going to be something that I need when I'm an adult, when I'm working, right? And really kind of bridging that gap for students sometimes. So all of these things are just really closely interwoven. So again, some supporting templates that are available in this area. We have our College and Career Readiness Student Mindsets and Competencies Action Plan. And this is a way for you to kind of plan out what you're going to do to address kind of those gaps, right? So going back to that data piece, what student standards, skills, what are the areas that need to be addressed? How are you going to address them? Is it school-wide? Is it just a specific grade level? Is it a specific classroom? Is that going to be addressed as a small group, right? And really making sure that you're kind of building those connections across time. So making sure that if you're using a concept that needed to be kind of built on, that you're doing that in like a sequential order that makes sense for students, right? And the other template that we have is the lesson plan and results report. And I love this template so much because it really puts everything that you need into one place. So it asks for those student objectives, right? Students will be able to, right? And what those steps are, right? And it gives you kind of that outline of we want to kind of introduce a concept, give students time to practice. And then at the very end, the results report part, right? Collecting that data. I gave the pre-quiz, right? Or pre-survey saying, I feel confident knowing how to ask for help, right? 1 to 5, right? And then giving that same post-survey so you can say, did my lesson change perception for students to know how to have some help-seeking behaviors, right? So it puts all of that, both the planning for the lesson and the data piece afterwards together in one place so that you can then make some decisions and say, yeah, students really did seem to understand how to ask for help after this lesson. Or, yikes, they didn't. What do I need to change in my lesson, right? What can I take from this lesson that's going to be effective in the future, right? So 2 really useful templates that you can use in these 2 areas. So the next area is our systemic approach to dropout prevention with social emotional supports, right? This should be about 30 to 40% of a counselor's time in the elementary school level. So this is our responsive services standard, if you will, really making sure that we're focused on those short-term supports and strategies for students that get them kind of back in the classroom, right? So helping students to identify those challenges and struggles they're facing, and then giving them those tools and strategies to kind of have as coping skills so that they can move forward. So some specific ways this kind of looks in the elementary setting is with, let me change my slide here. Here we go. Small group or individual counseling, right? So like I mentioned, there are going to be students that tier 1 collaborative classroom lesson was not enough and they need some more help and support to learn those skills. That's where we get this tier 2, tier 3 to maybe give them that small group or individual counseling, right? And this is also really important that we're making referrals, right? As counselors, we do not provide long-term counseling and we do not provide therapy, right? I think that sometimes gets confusing, but really making sure that we are clear on our limits and what we're trained in and what we're licensed to do, and having those resources and connections to provide those opportunities for students that they will need to access maybe outside of the school, in the community, or with maybe a partnership that the school has, right? So really making sure that we can give those resources and referrals to students and their families. Crisis counseling is obviously in emergencies. We unfortunately have more and more of those happening younger and younger, but making sure that we have kind of that crisis response plan There's a lot of other trainings related to coping with a loss in the school, responding to crises and different kind of emergency situations. So if you need more specific details about kind of responding to crisis, please let me know and I can direct you to those additional resources. So our last area is systemic program management. And like I mentioned, this is all of those indirect services that should not exceed 15% of the school counselor time. So that means 85% of our time as school counselors is collaborative classroom instruction, responsive services, and college and career readiness planning, right? So those three other areas, which basically means we're working with students. We are with students 85% of the time. The other 15% of the time is doing all of these other things on behalf of students, right? So talking to other people in your building that are on your student support multidisciplinary teams to say, what do we think about this student? What is the next steps? Do we need to give a referral? Do we need to put them in a different program, right? What do those things look like? And having those conversations with other members of your team. And really advocating for students, right? Looking at those policies and procedures to say, are there changes we need to make? How can I advocate for all students to be successful, right? So that's another thing I really want to make sure I've highlighted it multiple times, that school counselors are for all students. It is a tier 1 service to make sure all students have access to a school counselor. So at the end of the elementary implementation guide, there is a school counseling program self-evaluation. So we use this every year in the secondary setting. So I would encourage you every year to kind of do that reflection at the end of the year and say, how is my program doing, right? To go through the standards and say, am I meeting these standards? Am I approaching, right? Is this an area I need to focus more on to improve? Or is this an action item that I don't have implemented yet, right? So this really helps us to identify those areas of strength, areas for improvement, and helps us to set those goals, right? So pulling it back to being part of that leadership team in school improvement. How do those goals connect to the goals we have for our school counseling programs, okay? So the standards are the exact same that are found in the school counseling program model. The only difference is that standards 3 and 4 are kind of combined in the elementary implementation guide because there's already a lot of crossover in secondary, and we get a lot of questions about why these are 2 standards, even in the secondary level, because there's so much kind of overlap between these two. But this is really looking at those opportunities for students to do that career exploration piece. Right. So again, being intentional and making sure that we are kind of calling out to students, or even just in our lesson plans to ourselves, making sure we know how we are supporting this kind of career literacy piece, right? So lots of different activities that you can do to kind of help bring awareness to students, that you can engage families in, right? So lots of different ways that we can make sure that college and career readiness, career literacy is happening at the elementary level. So again, the program at a glance is looking at the strengths, your areas of improvement, and setting some measurable goals, okay? So on that page, you'll notice that in the elementary implementation guide, there's a lot of boxes, right? You don't have to fill out all the boxes, okay? We absolutely want every box filled out in the column that talks about your strengths. We want to know what you're doing well, right? We absolutely want something that is an area of improvement, right? Some things you want to focus on. But when it comes to that measurable goals piece, we want to be realistic, right? If we're trying to do 8 very specific measurable goals, that can be overwhelming, right? Especially when you add in, do they align with the school improvement plan goals? So yes, we can work on all of those standards, but where we're really going to have those specific measurable goals is just going to be in 1 or 2, right? So even though students say, I might want to go from a C to an A, maybe they go from a C to a B, right? So kind of that same idea of making sure we're setting reasonable goals for ourselves while we're also stretching ourselves, right? We want to continue to grow and improve, and we want to be able to kind of measure that success with these measurable goals, okay? So lots of different templates and supporting documents, right? So obviously the elementary implementation guide has all of this information in it. We also have those templates that I mentioned that have support for collaborative classroom instruction with kind of that action plan to have that big picture of what gaps do we see, how are we kind of going to instruct those, what levels, what timing, as well as individual lesson plan and results report. We didn't talk about it much, but the school data summary is another great template that you can use to collect that data piece. And we know that data is super important. Also, the principal counselor agreement, super, super, super key, especially in the elementary setting, that you are collaborating closely with your principal and making sure that everyone is really clear on your role and what you're going to be working on. So this agreement is very beneficial to do every single year. And then the last one is just the time task analysis. Again, doing that as a reflection to say, am I spending 85% of my time in direct services? And then after that, kind of digging a little deeper to say, am I doing my 85% of direct services kind of in those 3 areas that I'm expected to see, right? And that's where you can kind of have that step back and say, am I spending more time in tier 2, tier 3 responsive services than I am in that tier 1 collaborative classroom instruction? And then bringing that data to your principal counselor agreement meeting to kind of have those conversations of, do we need to make changes to the schedule? Do we need to make changes to roles and responsibilities, right? I think it really opens up that conversation. So again, if you have any issues accessing any of these templates or anything on our website, feel free to email us. You can email me, Bethany, both of us. We also have an account that's just schoolcounseling@schools.utah.gov, and you can email that with any questions. We monitor that email as well if you can't reach one of us directly. But as always, thank you so much for the work that you do. It is a busy time of year, and I feel like every part of the year is busy for school counselors. A lot that we're asked to do, but it's such important work. So just thank you so much for the work you are doing to support students, to prepare them to be successful now, and as they transition and move throughout their education, K-12, and their life after high school. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions to continue this conversation, and we'll get this recorded posting to our website soon. Thanks, everyone.